Hi, everyone. So remember in yesterday's story, we had gotten to the point where Peter had to drop Pax off in the woods because he's now living with his grandfather since his dad went off to fight the war. But he just found out that his father once had a dog, and Peter never knew that. So he's wondering, well, why couldn't I have kept the fox, which was his pet? But remember, his father said that he couldn't risk having the fox underfoot because his grandfather moves kind of slow now, and he was afraid the grandfather would trip over the fox. But Peter's not happy because, I mean, how would you like to have to give up your pet? All right, we're going to pick up where we left off. Um, so Peter's asking what time school starts in the new place he's living. Starts at 8, said his grandfather. They said to show up early and introduce yourself to the homeroom teacher, Mrs. Merez or Ramirez or something like that. I got you some supplies, said the grandfather. The old man nodded over to a spiral notebook, a beat up thermos, and a bunch of stubbly pencils bundled together with a thick rubber band. Peter walked over to the desk and put everything into his backpack. Thanks, Grandpa. Should I take the bus or walk? Oh, walk. Your father went to that school and he walked. Follow Ash Road to the end, turn right on School Street, and you'll see it. Big brick building. School Street. You got it? You leave by 7:30, you'll have plenty of time to make it there. Peter nodded. He wanted to be left alone. Okay, I'm all set, I guess. I guess I'll go to bed, said Peter. Oh, good, his grandfather replied, not bothering to hide the relief in his voice. He left, closing the door behind him firmly as if to say, You can have this room, but the rest of the house is mine. Peter stood by the door and listened to him walk away. After a minute, he heard the sound of dishes clattering in the sink. He pictured his grandfather in the cramped kitchen where they had eaten their silent dinner of stew, the kitchen that reeked so strongly of fried onions that Peter figured the smell would outlive his grandfather. After 100 years of scrubbing by a dozen different families, this house would probably still smell bitter. Peter heard his grandfather shuffle back along the hall to his bedroom, and then the low spark as a television caught, the volume turned down, an agitated news commentator barely audible. Only then did he toe off his sneakers and lie down on his narrow bed. 6 months, maybe more, of living here with his grandfather, who always seemed on the verge of blowing up. What's he always so mad about anyway? Peter had asked his father once, years ago. Everything. Life, his father had answered. He got worse after your grandmother died. After his own mother had died, Peter had watched his father anxiously. At first there had just been a frightening silence, but gradually his face had hardened into the permanent threat of a scowl, and his hands clenched in fists by his side, as if itching for something to set them off. Peter learned to avoid being that something, learned to stay out of his father's way. The smell of stale grease and onions crawled over him, seeping from the walls, from the bed itself. He opened the window beside him. The April breeze that blew in was chilly. Pax had never been alone outside before, except in his pen. Peter tried to extinguish the last sight he had had of his fox. He probably hadn't followed their car for long, but the image of him flopping down on the gravel shoulder, confused, was even worse. Peter's anxiety began to stir. All day, the whole ride here, Peter had sensed it coiling up inside him. It always seemed like a snake to him, his anxiety, waiting just out of sight, ready to slither up his spine, hissing its familiar taunt. You aren't where you should be. Something bad is going to happen because you aren't where you should be. He rolled over and pulled the cookie tin out from under the bed. He fished out the photo of his father with one arm slung so casually around the black and white dog, as if he had never worried he could lose him. Inseparable. He hadn't missed the note of pride that had entered his grandfather's voice as he had said that. Of course he had been proud. He had raised a son who knew about loyalty and responsibility, who knew that a kid and his pet should be inseparable. Suddenly the word itself seemed an accusation. He and Pax, what were they then? Separable? They weren't, though. Sometimes, in fact, Peter had had the strange sensation that he and Pax merged. The first time it had happened had been the first time he had taken Pax outdoors. The kit, remember that's the name for a baby fox, the kit had seen a bird and had strained against the leash, trembling as though electrified. And Peter had seen the bird through Pax's eyes, the miraculous lightning flight, the impossible freedom and speed. He had felt his own skin thrill and full body shivers, and his own shoulders burn as though yearning for wings himself. It had happened again this afternoon. He had felt the car spin away as though he were the one being left. His heart had quickened with panic. Tears stung again, and Peter palmed them with frustrated swipes across his eyes. His father had said it was the right thing to do. War is coming. It means sacrifices for everybody. I have to serve. It's my duty. And you have to go live with your grandfather. Of course, he'd been half expecting it. 2 of his friends' families had already packed up and left when the evacuation rumors had begun. What he hadn't expected was the rest, the worst part of what his father said. And that fox, well, it's time to send him back to the wild anyway. A coyote howled then, so nearby that it made Peter jump. A second one answered, and then a third. Peter sat up and slammed the window shut, but it was too late. The yips and howls and what they meant were in his head now. Peter had only 2 bad memories of his mother. He had a lot of good ones, too, and he often took those out to comfort himself, although he worried that they might fade from so much exposure. But the 2 bad ones he had buried deep. He did everything in his power to keep them buried. Now the coyotes were baying in his head, unearthing one of them. When he had been about 5, he had come upon his mother standing dismayed beside a bed of blood-red tulips. Half of them were standing at attention, half of them splayed over the ground, their blossoms crumbling. A rabbit got them. He must think the stems are delicious, that little devil, she had said. Peter had helped his father set a trap that night. We won't hurt him, right? asked Peter. Fine, we'll just catch him and then drive him into the next town. Let him eat someone else's tulips. Peter had baited the trap himself with a carrot, then begged his father to let him sleep in the garden to keep watch. His father had said no, but helped him set an alarm clock so he'd be the first to wake. When it went off, Peter had run to his mother's room to lead her outside by the hand to see the surprise in the trap. The trap lay on its side at the bottom of a freshly scraped crater at least 5 feet across. Inside was a baby rabbit, dead. There wasn't a single mark on its little body, but the cage was scratched and dented, and the ground all around clawed to rubble. Coyotes, his father said, joining them. They must have scared it to death trying to get in, and none of us even woke up to hear it. Peter's mother had opened the trap and lifted out the lifeless form of the rabbit. She held it to her cheek. They were just tulips, only a few tulips, she said. Peter found the carrot, one end nibbled off, and threw it as far as he could. Then his mother had placed the rabbit's body in his cupped palms and gone to get a shovel. With a single finger, Peter had traced the edge of the rabbit's ear, unfurling little ferns from its face and its paws, miraculously tiny, and the soft fur of its neck slick with his mother's tears. When she had returned, his mother had touched his face, which burned with shame. It's okay, Peter, she said. You didn't know. But it wasn't okay. For a long time afterward, when Peter closed his eyes, he'd seen coyotes, their claws raking dirt, their jaws snapping. He saw himself where he should have been, keeping watch in the garden that night. Over and over, he saw himself doing what he should have, rising from his sleeping bag, finding a rock, and hurling it. He saw the coyotes flinging back into the darkness, and he saw himself opening the trap to set the little rabbit free. And with that memory, the anxiety snake struck so hard that it stunned Peter's breath right out of him. He hadn't been where he should have been the night the coyotes killed the rabbit, and he wasn't where he should be now. He gasped to fill his lungs and sat bolt upright. He tore the photo in half and then in half again and pitched the pieces under the bed. Leaving Pax hadn't been the right thing to do. He jumped to his feet. He had already lost a lot of time. He fished some cargo pants, a long-sleeved camouflage t-shirt, and a fleece sweatshirt from his suitcase, and then an extra set of underwear and socks. He stuffed everything into his backpack except the sweatshirt, which he tied around his waist. Jackknife in his jeans pocket, wallet. He debated for a minute between his hiking boots and sneakers and decided on the boots, although he didn't put them on. He looked around the room, hoping to find a flashlight or anything resembling camping equipment. The room had been his father's when he was a boy, but aside from a few books on a shelf, it was clear his grandfather hadn't cleaned all his things out. The cookie tin had seemed to surprise him, kind of an oversight. Peter bumped his fingers over the spines of the books. An atlas. He pulled it down, amazed at his luck, and flipped through it until he came to the map that showed the route he and his father had traveled. "You'll only be 300 miles away," his father had tried to bridge the silence of the drive. "I get a day off, I'll come see you." Peter had known that would never happen. They didn't give days off during wars. Besides, it wasn't his father he was already missing. And then he saw something he hadn't realized. The highway snaked around a long range of foothills. If he cut straight across those instead of following the highway, he could save a lot of time, plus reduce the risk of being caught. He started to rip out the page, then realized he couldn't leave his grandfather such an obvious clue. Instead, he studied the map for a long moment, then replaced the atlas back on the shelf. 300 miles. It looked like he could shave off 100 of them by taking the shortcut, so say around 200 miles. If he could walk at least 30 miles a day, he could make it in a week or less. They had left Pax at the head of the access road that led to the ruins of an old rope mill. Peter had insisted on this road because hardly anyone ever used it. Pax didn't know about traffic, and because there are woods and fields all around. He'd go back and find Pax there, waiting in 7 days. He wouldn't let himself think about what might happen to a tame fox in those 7 days. No, Pax would be waiting at the side of the road, right where they had left him. He'd be hungry for sure, and probably scared, but he'd be okay. Peter would take him home. They would stay there. Just let someone try to make him leave this time. That was the right thing to do, to keep him. He and Pax, inseparable. He glanced around the room again, resisting the urge to just run. He couldn't afford to miss anything. The bed. He pulled the blanket off, rumpled the sheets up, and punched the pillow until it looked like he had slept on it. From his suitcase, he took out the picture of his mother he had kept on his bureau, the one taken on her last birthday, holding up the kite Peter had made for her, and smiling as if she had never had a better present in her life, and he slid it into his backpack. Next, he pulled out the things of hers that he had kept hidden in his bottom drawer at home. Her gardening gloves, still smudged with the last soil she had ever lifted. A box of her favorite tea, which had long ago lost its peppermint scent. The thick candy cane striped knee socks she wore in the winter. He touched them all, wishing he could take everything back home where it belonged, and then chose the smallest of the items, a gold bracelet with an enameled phoenix charm that she had worn every day, and tucked that into the middle of his backpack with the photo. Peter surveyed the room at a last time. He eyed his baseball and glove, and then crossed to the bureau and stuffed them into the backpack. They didn't weigh much, and he'd want them when he was back home. Besides, he just felt better when he had them. Then he eased the door open and crept to the kitchen. He set the backpack on the oak table, and in the dim light from above the stove, he began to pack supplies. A box of raisins, a sleeve of crackers, and a half-empty jar of peanut butter. Pax would come out of any kind of hiding spot for peanut butter. From the refrigerator, he took a bunch of string cheese sticks and 2 oranges. He filled the thermos with water and then hunted through drawers until he found matches, which he wrapped in tinfoil. Under the sink, he scored 2 lucky finds, a roll of duct tape and a box of heavy-duty garbage bags. A tarp would have been better, but he took 2 bags with gratitude and zipped the pack. Finally, he took a sheet of, you know what, I'm going to have to stop there. You're going to have to find out what he does finally and whether he takes off. See you later.